Hello everybody. Today, now we are going to talk about morality, honesty and social norms. My name is Bodo Herzog. I'm professor of economics. Well, morality, honesty and social norms are usually terms which are not really talked about and studied in economics. But you know, this is a class which is interdisciplinary, and we look to these expressions in this class now from an economics perspective, and you will also find then a discussion from a business ethics perspective. In the end, I believe that even economics can contribute some interesting insight about morality, honesty, and social norms. So my outline of this talk is structured in 4 points. First, let me introduce and motivate the discussion. Then I will study these expressions in a model. We will do some brief discussion, and then I will conclude the main findings. So let me start with some motivation. Usually agents who don't act in compliance with certain rules or laws or standards sometimes feel anxiety or regret. For instance, after tax evasion, or after bribery, or after cheating. Well, sometimes this could also be then a damage to the self-image and a traumatic experience to these people. And therefore, in business ethics and philosophy, you study this idea of let's develop some principles in general that people behave in an honest way, that they are not cheating. Obviously, it's a difficult question from an economic perspective to really study these expressions like honesty and morality. But we will see in my model, on the next slide, one way to approach even these difficult terms. So my question I will address in this talk is, how can we learn something about morality and honesty from an economics perspective? We will see it's not an easy topic, and it's quite sophisticated to talk about these terms from an economic perspective. Now let me talk about the model. The model is quite similar to the model we already used in another talk about tax evasion. So let me first introduce the terminology we need. There is let's say a taxpayer, and he has an exogenous income, and we label this by M. And then he declares a certain income to the tax authority, and again we label this by X. And the difference between M, the true income, and the declared income, X, is the evaded income. And we will label this with an E, and you can see these letters also on my slide. Then there's a tax rate you have to pay, the small t. And if you do tax evasion, and it's not detected by the tax authority, well, then you have a benefit, right? You saved paying taxes. And you will have a rate of return, an R, on these saved evaded incomes. And finally, we introduce a new variable. And this new variable is Xi. And this represents your honesty level, or the regret you feel if you do tax evasion. So these are the letters and the variables we need for the model. So now let me show you the model we are looking at. First of all, we set up a function. So what we are going to do is we maximize an expected utility function, and this expected utility function consists of 2 elements. First of all, the utility you obtain from tax evasion. And then you subtract from this first component a term that is reflecting the anxiety and regret of tax evasion. And that is Xi times the evaded income. So the greater Xi, that means the feeling is bad if you do tax evasion, the lower is the utility in the end. If Xi is very small, so if you have no morals at all, well then you subtract 0. That means it does not matter. So you can see the second component of my utility function on this slide is representing this term that is reflecting the honesty level of human beings, or the moral you have. Now what we are going to do next is we have to find the optimal amount of tax evasion, the optimal level of bribery, or the optimal level of cheating. So we optimize this expected utility function in respect of my variable e. The e is reflecting the evaded income. So we compute the first order condition. So let me do this once again here on the blackboard. So first of all, the expected utility function looks as follows. It's the expected utility of my income x, and that consists of two components. My utility function, dependent on the income I obtain from tax evasion, which is 1 minus t, the tax rate, times the true income m, plus r, which is the rate of return, times the tax I have to pay on the evaded income, e. This is the first component, and from this component we subtract this xi times e. E is once again the evaded income, and let me just write it down to make clear. E is nothing else as the difference between the true income and the declared income x. So this xi parameter, once again, that reflects the moral or the honesty you have. The greater your honesty, the less is the expected utility, because you feel bad. You subtract what you did, the tax evasion. If you have no morality at all, this is zero. You subtract nothing, and you just obtain utility, happiness from doing tax evasion or bribery or cheating. So this is the way I approach this problem of morality, honesty, or social norms. And now, as I already mentioned, I have to compute the first order condition. The first order condition is the first derivative of this utility function in respect of e. So we maximize this function in respect of my e, which is the evaded income. We immediately see that e is an element of the utility function in the first term. So if we compute the first derivative, it's u prime of what is in here. Let's call this x, this whole term. It's u prime of x times the inner derivative in respect of e. Well, the derivative of this in respect of e then is 1, so what remains is just r times t. So it's u prime r times t minus the derivative of the second component in respect of e is just xi. This equals 0. This is the first order condition you can also see from my slide. What can we learn from this first order condition? First of all, if you look to this equation, you would say, well, I cannot see so much. But let me rewrite this in another way. So let me bring the xi on the other side, and then we have a term that looks like u prime of x r times t is equal to xi. So let me look to the first order condition in this way. Well, what we see here is the following. The xi is reflecting your morals, your honesty level, in other words. And on the left-hand side, we have the derivative of the utility function. We call this the marginal utility. So let me explain this. What is the marginal utility? This term is reflecting the benefit you obtain from cheating. This is the benefit you obtain. The marginal utility is usually positive. And if the benefit you obtain is equal to the current moral or the current level of honesty you have, then they are equal. And that means you have a kind of maximum. By the way, it's not necessary to compute the second order condition in this case, because the second order condition is definitely negative, and this has to do with the assumption of the utility function. It's a concave function, and due to that assumption, we always have second order condition negative, that means it is definitely a maximum. There's another interesting insight. Suppose this first order condition is not an equality. Suppose it's an inequality, and we assume that the left-hand side is greater than the right-hand side. That means the benefit of tax evasion or the benefit of cheating or bribery, the utility I obtain from this is now greater. Yeah? The left-hand side is greater than my current honesty level. So if the utility I obtain from cheating is greater than my moral levels I have, well, then I will do this because I will benefit. I will have a benefit that is more than my heart is telling me. And now the question is, obviously, if this is the case, and that's the case why sometimes people cheat, why sometimes people are not behaving according to rules or laws, because they believe that the benefit they have from this is greater than the honesty or certain moral norms. So the question now is, if this is the case, how can we bring people back to an honest behavior? And here's where economics, in my view, comes into the picture. The economists would say, well, what we can do now, we can implement incentives. And there are two ways of incentives. On the one hand, we can use positive incentives, which is a reward. So I reward people that behave according to rules, that are frank and honest. And by this, I lower the marginal utility you obtain from cheating, because you get a reward if you are compliant with the rules. There's another possibility, and that is a negative incentive, which is a punishment. If you are not behaving according to the rules, then you are punished, and that will also reduce the marginal utility of cheating or of tax evasion. So you see, by economic incentives, we can influence the marginal utility and bring the marginal utility once again back to make this inequality towards an equality, to the optimum again. And therefore I think economics can provide some interesting insights to solve the problem of misbehavior, of tax evasion or cheating or bribery. There is another view to this equation, and that is, well, can we change the XI, the honesty level itself? Here, frankly, economists cannot really say so much about this. That is what usually people in philosophy and business ethics talk about. They try to find certain principles, certain rules that may change my honesty level, my XI parameter in this model. And there is a famous approach by Immanuel Kant developed centuries ago, the so-called categorical imperative. On a high level, you can say the categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant is telling you, well, if you behave according to your heart, then it's good for you, but it's also good for others. And that means that if you are following this rule, the XI, the moral level you follow, is very high. And by this, you also make this inequality maybe back into an equality. If you're able to increase XI to a higher level, then you can reduce this inequality again towards an equality. Well, the question is, how can we really implement this idea from a philosophical perspective into praxis? And why do people, despite they know this idea on a high level, why do people not really behave like this on a daily basis? Why do we have tax evasion? Why do we have cheating and bribery in reality? I think the simple answer is because all these theories in philosophy and business ethics, they provide some important and interesting insights, no doubt, but they are not really feasible and effective in reality. And therefore, I strongly believe the economics answer to solve this problem, and that is try to change the marginal utility, is far more effective and feasible. And that is what basically the law and order, our legal system, tries to do. They put incentives in place They reward people that behave according to rules, or they punish people if they don't behave according to rules. And that brings you back to a moral behavior you would define by a law. Now let me discuss a further aspect of this model. There is a theorem by Gordon, and Gordon studies, well, what is going on if there are different levels of honesty, xi. And he finds that if the honesty level, this xi, is very large, then people always stick to the rules. In other words, if the tax rate in this model is increasing and increasing, usually you would expect then people prefer to evade taxes. But if your honesty level is very high, then Gordon shows that even with increasing taxes, people would not start evading taxes. But if the honesty level is low, that is what Gordon shows as well, then people start to evade taxes if the tax rate increases and increases further and further. So you see, there should be an optimal honesty level. And if your honesty is too low, well, then you do bribery, you cheat, and you evade taxes. And I want to show you the second aspect of Gordon's theorem within this model. To show this, well, what we have to do is we study the first order condition in respect of two variables, the tax rate and the evaded income. And this technique is called, again, comparative statics, a technique we also already applied in the other class of tax evasion. So let me compute the impact of my tax rate T on the evaded income E. This is the technique of comparative statics. So we take the first order condition here, and now we compute the total differential in respect of T and then in respect of E. So first of all, compute the total differential of the first order condition in respect of E. Well, we see there is no E here, there is no letter E here, the evaded income, but the E is inside my utility function, as you can see on top of my blackboard here. So if we compute the derivative in respect of E, we compute the second derivative of my utility function, and then we compute the inside derivative in respect of E, which is again R times T. But we have here R times T, so if we have R times T times again R times T, is nothing else than R times T squared. So this is the derivative in respect of my variable dE. And then we continue and we compute the derivative of the first order condition in respect of T, the tax rate. Well, the tax rate appears here, and it is inside my utility function. So we have a product of two terms. And if we compute the derivative of a product, we have to apply the so-called product rule. First, we compute the derivative of the first term in respect of T, which is just R, and we keep this term as given, u prime of x. Then we add, according to the product rule, we keep this term as given, R times T, and then we compute the derivative of this component in respect of T. Well, this is the second derivative of my utility function in respect of T, and then we have to take a look what is inside my utility function. And inside my utility function, you see there are two T's. One in the second term, which is R times E. We compute the derivative in respect of T, then the T is 1, and the remaining components are R times E. And then we have a T component also in the first term, which is the derivative is then 1 for the T, then it's just minus M. So this is the derivative of the first order condition in respect of T equals 0. That's it. And now we just rearrange, simple algebra, this equation. So we bring this second component on the right-hand side. Then this plus moves into gets a minus. And then we bring the t down. So what we obtain with some experience, you can see this immediately, is dE divided by dt is equal to minus. Now we have a fraction. In the numerator, we have this term, which is r times u prime of x plus r times t, second derivative of the utility function in respect of x, times this component r times e minus m. And in the denominator, we have this term, which is second derivative double prime of my utility function in respect of x, and in brackets r times t square. So take a look to this fraction for a second. We know, due to the assumption of the utility function, that the second derivative of my utility function is always negative. That's a law of diminishing utility. And that's also true for this second derivative. It's negative. The first derivative, by the way, is positive. That's the marginal utility, the benefit you obtain from evading taxes. Now that's positive. The rate of return is positive, of course. The tax rate and the rate of return, both terms are positive as well. Here we have a term in square. Well, if we square a number, that is always positive. So what we can see now, the denominator is a negative number. It's negative times positive. So in overall, what we have here in the denominator is negative. What is the number here in my numerator? Well, this is a positive number. Then we add positive. This is negative. What is the term here in the bracket? This is my true income. And this is the evaded income. Well, it's obvious, my true income, if I have an income of, let's say, 4,000 euros, then I evade a couple of taxes, let's say 100 euros, well, my true income is always greater than the evaded income. And therefore, this is negative, because this number is greater than this number. So what we have here then in this second component is a negative times negative is positive number. So we have a positive number and we add a positive number. So the whole term here in the numerator is positive. Divided by a negative number gives me something negative, but together with the negative sign in front makes me in the end definitely a positive number. What does this positive sign is telling us? Well, the higher the tax rate, T, I have to pay on my income, there's a positive relationship with the evaded income. The more taxes I prefer to evade, the higher the tax rate, the higher is the weighted income. This is the second part of Gordon's theorem. So if the honesty level, this Xi parameter, is too low, then you would prefer with higher taxes to evade taxes. So this is obvious, but as I told you, I can also show with a slight modification of this model, if your honesty level, if the honesty parameter Xi is very large, then this relationship is the opposite. Then even if the tax rate increases, people would not start and prefer to evade taxes. They would start to reduce tax evasion because they feel bad if they do tax evasion. So this is what you can show within this model. And once again, the secret is not the determination of this honesty variable Xi. The secret is to think about the marginal utility. How can we impact and change the marginal utility? So now let me conclude. Okay, so we have seen now in this very brief talk about honesty, morality and social norms from an economic perspective, that the terms are quite difficult to handle in an economic model. And frankly, I have to admit that an economics approach cannot really tell you so much about this honesty parameter Xi I have introduced. I cannot develop general principles, and I cannot tell you how to change the honesty and the morality of human beings. But I can offer you an opposite but complementary insight how to make people behave more honestly. And that is, we have to think about economic incentives. With economic incentives, positive incentives, I mean rewards, or negative incentives, punishment, I can bring people that they behave more honestly or in line with rules, compliant with certain criteria or principles. There are open questions. The economics approach cannot answer how to influence the honesty parameter or the honesty level in general. And I cannot answer what is determining this honesty level. But I can answer how can we make people more compliant. And that is by influencing, incentivizing the marginal utility people obtain from a certain behavior. And therefore I think even economics have a certain information about these terms, which are usually just discussed in philosophy and in business ethics. So if you're interested in learning more about morality, honesty, and social norms from a business ethics perspective, take a look to the class of my colleague, Professor Bernd Banke. I hope you have learned in this class the opposite view, the economics view to these terms of honesty, morality, and social norms. Have a good day. Bye-bye.